The letter arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, tucked into the mailbox like any other piece of mail. But this one was different. It wasn't a bill. It wasn't a flyer. It was a threat. And before I even opened it, I felt it in my gut. Something wasn't right. The words on that paper weren't just a violation notice. They were a warning. A warning that someone I didn't know, was coming for everything I'd spent my entire life building. My family's land. Our history. Our future. And that RV parked in the corner of our farm, it was the first thing on their list. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a battle I never saw coming. A battle that would expose corruption, test my limits, and push me to the brink of losing everything. But the one thing they didn't know was this. I wasn't going to go down without a fight. There are certain places in life that hold more than just land. Some places become part of who we are, woven into the very fabric of our identity. For the Turner family, this 15-acre farm wasn't just a piece of property. It was a legacy. It was a place where their roots ran deeper than any tree in the orchard, a place where memories were etched in the soil itself. Their great-grandfather, a man who worked tirelessly with his hands, built this farm from scratch in 1932. The air smelled of history, and the landscape was forever tied to the Turner name. When you live on land for generations, it's not just soil beneath your feet. It's a piece of your soul, passed down, worn and weathered by time. They grew up here. They learned to walk on this land. This was the place where weddings were celebrated, where the sound of children's laughter filled the air, and where the quiet hum of the evening crickets was the soundtrack to their lives. It was a place of comfort, of stability. But stability is a fragile thing. As decades passed, new developments crept closer. Homes began springing up, and the peaceful landscape that had once been theirs alone was now encroached upon by people who didn't understand what this farm meant. And when new neighbors, the kind who don't appreciate the value of heritage, began to move in, things began to change. The kind of people who believe everything can be bought, land, history, and even memories. But to the Turners, this land was priceless. It was not just their home. It was their inheritance. The land their great-grandfather had worked so hard to cultivate. The soil where they'd buried loved ones. The place that had kept the Turner name alive for over 100 years was under threat. And when they received a letter from the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, the HOA, demanding that they move their grandfather's RV off their own property, it felt like a slap in the face. How could something so trivial, a vintage RV parked for decades, be the catalyst for such a fight? But this wasn't just about the RV. This was about something much bigger. Their family's right to remain in their own home, on their own land. And that, my friends, was something they weren't going to let go of without a fight. When the first notice came, it didn't seem like much. Just a small, bureaucratic letter tucked into the mailbox. It had that sterile, cold feel of something impersonal, a notice about a violation, the kind of thing you would expect from a HOA that had no real connection to the land or the people living on it. But what began as a small issue quickly spiraled into something much more. The letter, signed by Evelyn Montgomery, the president of Willow Creek Estates HOA, stated that the RV, a beloved family relic, was an eyesore and was violating community standards. It was an easy thing to dismiss at first, but it wasn't the first time the Turners had felt the weight of the changes happening in their neighborhood. Over the years, they had seen an increasing number of fancy homes being built just beyond the ridge. Homes with manicured lawns, carefully sculpted bushes, and security cameras that watched everything. These weren't just new neighbors, they were outsiders, encroaching on the life they had built. What the Turners didn't realize was that they weren't just dealing with a group of neighbors who wanted things to look nice. No, they were dealing with a much larger force, a machine built on money, power, and control. And this machine had its eyes on their land. What began as a simple dispute over an RV turned into a calculated, silent invasion. The HOA was moving with precision, their every step planned, their every move intentional. It was no longer just about the RV. It was about the land, the very land that had been in the Turner family for generations. As the weeks passed, the Turners noticed more and more cars from Willow Creek Estates driving past their property, slowing down as they took note of the RV, the barn, the trees, the things that were part of their daily life. They weren't just looking, they were plotting. Every time the Turners went into town, they felt the weight of eyes watching them. There was a sense of unease growing in the pit of their stomachs. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just about an eyesore. It was about control. And the more they realized that, the more determined they became not to let it slip through their fingers. But as their quiet, peaceful existence began to unravel, they faced a question that many older generations struggle with. How much of your past can you hold onto when the world is moving forward, trying to erase the things that are important to you? The Turners weren't just fighting for a piece of property. They were fighting for their history, their memories, their very right to exist in a place they had spent their whole lives. When the tow truck arrived, the air around the Turner farm shifted. It wasn't just the rumble of the engine, the smell of diesel fumes in the air, or the crunch of gravel beneath the wheels. It was something deeper, the feeling that something precious was being ripped away from you, without warning, without understanding. The Turners had been blindsided. The RV that had stood there, fading gently into the landscape, was suddenly a target. Lily, the Turners' young daughter, was the first to notice the truck's flashing lights from the window. She didn't understand what was happening. She was just a child, but her eyes were filled with fear, the same fear that had gripped the hearts of her parents. The RV was meant to be a place of family vacations, of bonding, of memories that would never be replaced. And now, it was being taken from them, piece by piece, by a group of strangers who had no connection to the land, no appreciation for the history, no understanding of what that RV meant. The tow truck driver didn't even bother to look up when the father ran to confront him. He was just doing his job, following orders, the orders of people who had no business being on this land. And that's when the Turner family realized just how far things had gone. This wasn't just a matter of some simple neighborhood dispute. This was something far more sinister. The HOA, led by Evelyn Montgomery, had crossed a line. They had the power to force people out, to take what didn't belong to them, and they weren't afraid to use it. Evelyn's voice dripped with cold authority as she stepped from her car, her designer clothes perfectly pressed, her smile unwavering despite the tension. "Mr. Turner," she said, with a tone that implied she knew something he didn't. "This RV must be removed." It wasn't just about the RV anymore. Evelyn wasn't just an HOA president. She was the embodiment of power, greed, and control. She held a kind of cruel confidence that left the Turners reeling. But they weren't ready to back down. They weren't ready to give up their family's history, their heritage, their land. The fight had just begun to anyone outside the Turner family. It may have seemed like just another old vehicle. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't modern. But to the Turners, that 1978 Winnebago was a piece of their heart. It was a connection to their past, to the time when their family would pile into the RV and set off on trips to places like Yellowstone. The memories held within those walls were more valuable than anything money could buy. It wasn't just a van. It was the essence of the Turner family story. The RV had been with them through thick and thin. It had been there when their late wife and mother first fell in love with the open road. It had witnessed family milestones, laughter, and tears. It was the place where their daughter, Lily, had spent many summers learning about the world, surrounded by the love of her parents and grandparents. Every dent, every stain, every worn-out seat told a story that they weren't ready to let go of. And that's what made it so painful when Evelyn Montgomery and her group came into the picture. Evelyn didn't see the memories. She didn't see the love and the tradition. She saw a blight on the neighborhood, a hindrance to property values. She wasn't concerned about preserving family history. She was concerned with her vision of perfection. But perfection doesn't come with a soul. It doesn't come with the stories of the past, the lessons learned over decades. And in this case, perfection was nothing more than a shiny new house, standing where real, lived-in history used to be. For the Turners, it wasn't just about keeping an old RV. It was about keeping the pieces of their life intact. The RV was a testament to who they were and who they had been. The idea of losing it, the idea of letting someone else take it away, was more than just a fight for property. It was a fight for their very identity. The tow truck was only the beginning. The moments of peaceful solitude the Turners had known for decades were now slipping away. Every morning, They could feel it. A strange kind of tension in the air. Their beloved farm, which had stood untouched for so long, was becoming a battleground. And it wasn't just the RV anymore. As the HOA continued to impose its will, they began to demand that the Turners fix things that had never been an issue before. The paint on the barn was too chipped. The fences weren't aligned. The tools scattered around the property were unsightly. Every small imperfection became a target. The very things that made the Turner family's farm a home, the imperfections, the authenticity, the character, were now seen as faults. As the demands piled up, so did the weight on the Turners' shoulders. Their peaceful life was being turned upside down by a system they never asked to be part of. A system that didn't care about the things that mattered, the legacy, the memories, the bonds of family. They cared only about conformity, about making everything look the same, about erasing the beauty of a life well lived in favor of shiny, new facades. But the Turners weren't going to be erased. Not yet. Not without a fight. When the Turners began facing this fight alone, they didn't know how deep the water was. At first, it felt like the entire world was against them. The HOA, with its polished, high-end members, seemed to have all the power, money, and influence to back their claims. Evelyn Montgomery had a certain kind of cold confidence about her, one that made the Turners question if they could ever win. But what they didn't realize was that they weren't truly alone. As the pressure mounted, something remarkable began to happen. Their neighbors, many of whom had lived in the area as long as the Turners, began to notice the same things. Little by little, the community that had once been quiet, humble, and isolated began to stir. It wasn't just the Turners who felt the weight of the HOA's demands. Other families who had been living in the shadow of these pristine, cookie-cutter developments started to see that the very foundation of their way of life was being threatened. Diane Wilson, the local gardener who had always kept to herself, was the first to step forward. She had heard the commotion and seen the tow truck pulling up the Turners' long driveway. Diane had watched as the land around her slowly began to change, as developers tried to sneak in and take over their community. She knew something wasn't right. Her voice, once quiet, now carried the weight of an entire community behind it. She hurried across the road to stand by the Turners. "Don't let them take what's ours," she called out. "They tried it with my husband's boat last week, and they'll do it to all of us if we let them." The Turners weren't alone anymore. Neighbors they'd known for decades began stepping out of the shadows, each one bringing their own stories of strange notices, invasive actions, and increasingly odd demands from the HOA. Each of these families had their own history, their own stakes, their own memories tied to the land. They weren't going to let a group of entitled strangers tear it all down. Together, they formed a united front, not just for the RV, but for the land, the traditions, and the legacy that held their community together. It wasn't just about one family anymore. It was about all of them. And in the face of this growing alliance, the HOA, for the first time, was starting to look weak. What the Turners didn't know, what none of them realized at first, was that this was bigger than just a dispute over an RV or a property line. The HOA's actions weren't random, and they weren't personal. They had a plan, one that had been years in the making. Evelyn Montgomery, with her perfectly pressed clothes and flawless smile, wasn't just a homeowner trying to keep the neighborhood looking pristine. No, she had something far more sinister in mind. The more the Turners investigated, the more they began to see the puzzle pieces fitting together. Evelyn wasn't just the HOA president. She was the key to a much larger, more dangerous scheme. Evelyn's husband, Stanley Montgomery, owned the towing company, Precision Towing, and it turned out that he had more than just an interest in towing RVs. He had his eyes on something far more valuable, the land that the Turners, the Wilsons, the Johnsons, and the other families lived on. It was prime real estate, and with the help of the HOA, they planned to get their hands on it. The HOA had been manipulating the situation for years, creating false violations and towing families' belongings to push them out of their homes. All the while, the Montgomerys and their developer friends were quietly scooping up the land, bit by bit. They didn't want just the Turners' RV. They wanted the whole farm. They wanted the orchard. They wanted the entire community. The realization hit like a slap in the face. This wasn't just about fixing a neighborhood or making it look nicer. This was about forcing families out so that developers could build luxury homes, turning the once peaceful land into high-priced real estate. And Evelyn, with her cold smile and careful words, was the face of the operation. She had been playing a long game, and the Turners, for the first time, felt truly outmatched. But they weren't going to just give up. They were going to fight back, not just for their land, but for the families who had spent generations in the same place, building a life on the very soil that was now being threatened. As the days passed, the emotional toll on the Turners began to show. The pressure of the situation, constant threats, legal battles, and the looming fear of losing everything was weighing heavily on them. The family had spent years on this land, creating memories that were impossible to replace. Yet now, those memories were under siege, and the life they had built was crumbling before their eyes. The biggest blow came when the Turners' youngest, Lily, began to show signs of stress. The once happy, bright-eyed child, who loved nothing more than camping in her grandfather's RV, now had a nervous edge. She didn't understand why people were trying to take the RV. She didn't understand why her family was fighting. All she knew was that the place where she spent her happiest moments, the RV, was in danger of being taken from them. One night, as the family sat around the dinner table, trying to hold onto a semblance of normalcy, Lily's voice broke through the tension. "Are we going to lose Grandpa's RV?" she asked, her small face etched with worry. The question hit hard, and for the first time, the weight of everything they were fighting for became crystal clear. It wasn't just about the RV. It wasn't just about the land. It was about Lily's future, about keeping her connected to the past, to the family history that was slipping away. For the first time, they realized that this fight wasn't just for the land. It was for the future of the next generation. But what was even harder was watching how the stress was affecting their aging mother, the matriarch of the family, who had witnessed the farm's rise and fall. She saw how the world was changing, and though she tried to remain strong, the weight of it all was beginning to break her spirit. Every conversation with her felt like an emotional battle, and her heart ached every time she talked about the possibility of losing the farm. The Turners knew they couldn't let this stand. They couldn't let the Montgomerys win. Not when so much was at stake. The lessons they'd learned over decades, hard work, persistence, and community, were about to come into play. It was time to fight, not just for their home, but for everything their family had built. One morning, after the tension in the house had reached a breaking point, the protagonist stumbled upon something. A piece of paper hidden away in the attic, buried among old family records. It was an old agreement, something from the 1970s. An agreement made by their grandfather when he allowed the neighboring farm to use their access road. At first glance, it seemed like nothing important, just a simple agreement between two farmers. But as the protagonist carefully read the document, something began to dawn on them. The old access road, the one that ran through their property, was now being used as the main entry point into Willow Creek Estates. And though the agreement had been simple, it now seemed to be the crux of the HOA's claim over the Turner land. The document gave the neighboring farm, now part of the Willow Creek Estates, certain rights over the shared access road, rights that could be interpreted as giving them jurisdiction over a part of the Turner farm. The realization hit hard. Could this old agreement, made decades ago, be the key to the HOA's claim? And if so, how had they never seen it before? Had their great-grandfather unknowingly signed away a part of their land? And more importantly, could this be the reason the HOA felt they had the right to interfere in their lives? The document was a double-edged sword. It gave the HOA a foothold, but it didn't give them control over the entire farm. Still, it felt like a trap that was set long ago, without the Turners ever realizing it. But it wasn't too late. This could be the key to their defense. They just needed to dig deeper, to understand the true implications of this agreement, and to find a way to fight back. As the HOA's threats continued to escalate, the Turners knew that they couldn't simply sit back and let this happen. It was time to take action. The legal battle was looming, and though they had no experience in dealing with such things, they were determined to protect their home. The Turners reached out to a local lawyer who specialized in property disputes. He was no stranger to the struggles of rural families facing off against powerful developers, But even he was shocked by the scope of the HOA's actions. "This is more than just an HOA problem," he told them. "This is a land grab. This is about forcing families out so developers can move in." With the lawyer's help, the Turners began to gather evidence. They combed through old records, cross-referenced maps, and consulted with other families who had faced similar issues. The more they learned, the more they realized just how deep the corruption went. But they also realized something else. The longer they waited, the stronger the HOA's grip became. Every day that passed, the situation grew more desperate, and though the legal road ahead was uncertain and full of hurdles, the Turners knew that it was their only shot at keeping the farm, keeping the memories, and keeping their future intact. The more the Turners dug into the history of their farm, the more they realized just how carefully the trap had been set. For weeks, they had been scrambling to understand the details of the violation notices, the sudden appearance of a towing company with ties to the HOA, and the questionable land claims. But nothing had prepared them for the discovery that would change everything. A decades-old agreement hidden in a dusty box in the attic, sealed in an envelope and buried under family mementos. The agreement, made in the late 1970s, allowed their neighboring farm to use the access road that ran through their property. At the time, it seemed harmless, just two farmers helping each other out, allowing each other to pass freely over the land they shared. But now, that innocent gesture had been weaponized. The wording was vague enough to be interpreted in a way that allowed the Willow Creek Estates HOA to claim jurisdiction over part of the Turner property. As they stared at the old contract, the reality began to sink in. The HOA, using this agreement as a legal loophole, now argued that the Turners' farm was partially within their jurisdiction, thanks to the access road. And it wasn't just about a bit of road. It was about using that access point to claim control over their land, the very land their great-grandfather had fought so hard to preserve. It wasn't just a violation of property rights. It was a legal trick, a move that made the Turners feel like pawns in someone else's game. The worst part was, the Turners hadn't even known the true extent of what their great-grandfather had signed. They had assumed that the agreement was benign, that it was just a neighborly gesture. But it wasn't. It was the perfect entry point for the Montgomerys, and now they were using it to strip the Turners of their land. The realization stung. The land that had been in their family for generations, that had been a symbol of hard work and perseverance, was now under threat due to a legal loophole. But this discovery gave them new hope. They could fight back. The agreement wasn't a death sentence. It was an opening. If they could prove the HOA was misinterpreting or overstepping the bounds of this old agreement, they might just have a chance to protect what was rightfully theirs. The more the Turners uncovered, the clearer it became that the HOA wasn't just trying to evict them from their home. This was a well-orchestrated, systematic effort to take over land and drive out families who had been there for decades. As the situation began to escalate, they realized that they needed more than just neighbors and family. They needed legal help. They needed someone who understood how to fight a battle this big, someone who could go toe-to-toe with a corrupt system and win. They turned to an attorney, a seasoned veteran who had dealt with land disputes before. His name was Sam, and he was no stranger to the type of games that developers and HOA leaders played. When Sam walked through their front door for the first time, the Turners felt a spark of hope. But Sam didn't sugarcoat things. He understood the stakes, and he understood how much they were up against. "This is more than just a dispute over an RV or a fence," Sam said, after hearing the Turner story. "This is a battle for your land, your future, and your family's legacy. What they're doing is nothing short of a land grab. They're trying to force you out, piece by piece, so they can sell this land to developers at a premium. And it's not just happening here. They've been doing this in several counties." Sam's words hit hard. The idea that this wasn't just one family's fight, it was the fight of many, opened the Turners' eyes. They were up against a network of people who had been manipulating the legal system to their advantage for years. But they weren't going to back down. With Sam's help, they began to gather documents, track the history of their property, and research zoning laws. Every piece of evidence they gathered brought them one step closer to understanding just how deep the conspiracy ran. As the days passed, the legal battle loomed larger and larger. Sam told them they had a strong case, but it would take time, effort, and resources. Every document they uncovered painted a clearer picture of the corruption surrounding the HOA. It wasn't just a fight for an RV. It was a fight for their land, their future, and their right to remain in the place they called home. The Turners knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with the legal strategy in place, they could start to make a stand. The more the Turners dug into the background of Willow Creek Estates and its HOA, the more they uncovered about the people behind the scenes, people who had used their power and influence to manipulate the system for years. The face of this effort, of course, was Evelyn Montgomery, the HOA president. On the surface, she seemed like the picture of professionalism, well-dressed, well-spoken, and always in control. But as the Turners learned more about her, they began to see that her polished exterior was a mask, hiding a ruthless woman who would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. Evelyn wasn't just the HOA president. She was a key player in a much bigger game, a game that involved her husband Stanley, who owned Precision Towing, the company responsible for the illegal tows. Stanley wasn't just towing vehicles. He was helping the developers clear the land, one property at a time, by using legal loopholes and false claims to force homeowners to sell or face steep fines and fees. But Evelyn's role in all of this went even deeper. She wasn't just a figurehead for the HOA. She was the mastermind behind the entire operation. She controlled the flow of information, carefully manipulating the homeowners in Willow Creek Estates, using her position to get what she wanted. And what she wanted was simple: to drive the Turners, the Wilsons, and every other family off their land, so developers could buy it for a fraction of its value and build luxury homes in its place. The Turners knew they were up against more than just a corrupt HOA. They were up against a network of people who had been working in the shadows for years. This was no longer just a neighborhood dispute. It was a full-blown conspiracy. And Evelyn Montgomery wasn't the only one involved. As the Turners learned more, they discovered that several key figures on the zoning board were also involved, pushing through amendments that gave the HOA more control over neighboring properties, without ever informing the landowners. But the deeper the Turners dug, the more they realized that they weren't alone in this fight. Evelyn's actions had caught the attention of more than just the Turners. They had caught the attention of others who had been victimized by the same people. Together, they would form an alliance, a united front against the corruption that had been allowed to flourish for so long. And as they gathered their forces, they began to realize that they weren't just fighting for their property. They were fighting for the future of their entire community. For the Turners, this wasn't just about protecting a piece of property. It was about protecting everything that had come before them. Their great-grandfather had built a farm with his own hands, and for generations, the Turner family had worked the land, cared for it, and made it their home. It wasn't just a farm. It was a part of their identity. It was where the family had celebrated every major milestone, birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays. The deeper the battle went, the more emotional the stakes became. It wasn't just about an RV or the land. It was about memories. The memories of summer spent in the RV, driving to Yellowstone with their grandfather, of learning how to fish with their father beside the old pond. These weren't just memories. They were the foundation of the Turner family's history. And those memories were being threatened by a group of people who didn't care about history, family, or legacy. They only cared about profit. The toll of the fight began to show on the Turners. There were sleepless nights spent lying awake, wondering if they would lose everything they held dear. Their daughter Lily, who had grown up with these same memories, was beginning to feel the weight of it too. It wasn't just her family's RV at risk. It was her entire sense of security, her sense of home. The Turners couldn't bear the thought of losing that connection to the past. The emotional weight of the situation was heavy. But in the midst of it, they realized something important. This wasn't just about protecting a piece of land. It was about preserving the values that had shaped their family for generations. Hard work, resilience, and a deep love for what they had built. And they would fight for those values, no matter what it took. When the Turners started their fight, they thought they were in it alone. But what they hadn't expected was that the battle would draw in other families who were just as determined to fight back. Diane Wilson, a neighbor who had always kept to herself, was the first to approach them. Diane had been living on her farm for just as long as the Turners, and when she saw what was happening, she knew that she couldn't stand by and do nothing. Diane's husband had been harassed by the HOA just weeks earlier when they tried to tow his boat. Diane had kept quiet for years, believing that if she stayed under the radar, she would be left alone. But after seeing the way the Turners were being treated, she realized that no one was safe. It wasn't just about one family. It was about the whole community. Diane, with her quiet determination, was the first to offer help. She began digging into county records, researching zoning laws, and looking for any evidence that could prove the HOA was overstepping its bounds. Her help was invaluable. She had a sharp eye for details, and she quickly discovered several legal inconsistencies in the HOA's claims. But Diane wasn't the only one. As word spread about the Turners' fight, other families began to come forward. The Wilsons, the Johnsons, even the Patel family. Each one had been affected by the HOA's growing power. They realized that they were stronger together. The Turners had unknowingly formed a coalition of families who were willing to stand up against the corruption that had taken root in Willow Creek Estates. And together, they were ready to fight. As the days dragged on, it became clear to the Turners that they could no longer sit idly by and wait for the situation to resolve itself. Evelyn Montgomery and her entourage weren't backing down, and neither were the Turners. The entire farm was at risk, and it wasn't just their RV anymore. It was their entire life, their entire history, being threatened by a group of ruthless individuals who had no regard for family, for tradition, for anything other than profit. Then came the moment that would change everything. It was an early morning, one of those moments where the sun had barely crept over the horizon, and the air was still heavy with the quiet of the night. The Turners were jolted awake by the sound of approaching vehicles. It was the tow truck, but this time it wasn't just one. It was a fleet. Evelyn Montgomery's car was at the forefront, flanked by two other SUVs, each carrying men in dark suits. There was no mistaking it now. They had come for everything. They had come for the land, and they had come to push the Turners out, piece by piece. The father stood in the kitchen, watching the scene unfold through the window. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone, calling the sheriff. There wasn't time to waste anymore. The RV had already been targeted, but now they were coming for more. His barn, the tools, the farm itself. Lily stood beside him, eyes wide with confusion and fear, but her father didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the approaching trucks, the same trucks that had taken the RV before, the same trucks that had come for his neighbors. He felt a cold rage building up inside of him, but he kept his composure. This was it. This was the moment he had feared and hoped wouldn't come. They were coming for the farm, and they were coming for everything his family had built. When Evelyn finally stepped out of her car, her heels clicking sharply against the gravel, there was no longer any pretense. No sugar-coated words or false smiles. She was all business now. Her eyes narrowed as she surveyed the scene. She knew that this wasn't going to be as easy as the last time. The air was thick with tension as the Turners stood their ground, refusing to let Evelyn and her team push them further. "Mr. Turner, we're being reasonable here," Evelyn said coolly. "This property is an eyesore. You've had multiple violations. It's time to comply." But the Turners knew the truth now. This wasn't about violations. This was about power, about control. "We've complied for too long," the father said, voice steady but filled with an anger that was impossible to ignore. "This farm isn't for sale, and neither are we." Evelyn's face flickered with frustration, but she quickly masked it. "If you refuse to comply, the consequences will only grow more severe. You'll lose everything." The father stood tall. "We're not going anywhere. This fight is far from over." And just as it seemed like the situation would explode into a full-blown confrontation, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up, lights flashing. Sheriff Mercer, a familiar figure to the Turners, stepped out. He had been a part of the family's life for years, trusted, reliable. The Turners breathed a sigh of relief as he approached Evelyn. "I'm afraid this operation is over, Mrs. Montgomery," Sheriff Mercer said, his voice firm but calm. "The documentation you've provided is being reviewed, and I've got some concerns about its validity. No more towing today." Evelyn's perfectly composed face tightened, but there was nothing she could do. The law was on the Turner side for now, and it felt like a small victory. But the fight was far from over. The fight while temporarily on hold, was taking its toll on the Turner family. The sheriff had called a halt to the towing, but the paperwork, the battles, and the mounting pressure were wearing everyone down. Lily, who had been so hopeful just days before, was now showing signs of strain. She was quieter than usual, her bright eyes filled with worry. The weight of the situation was heavy on her small shoulders. Her once carefree world was now filled with uncertainty. Would they lose the farm? Would they lose their home? The constant stress of seeing her parents fight, hearing about the legal battles, and witnessing the RV being towed away, left her feeling hopeless. The innocent joy that had once filled her face had been replaced by an edge of fear, of not knowing whether her family would still be here tomorrow. The Turners didn't have all the answers. As the battle raged on, the family was torn between what they knew was right and what seemed like an inevitable outcome. The protagonist's spouse, who had always been supportive, began to question whether it was worth it. The family was under siege, not just by Evelyn and her cohorts, but by the weight of exhaustion, by the uncertainty of their future. Should they keep fighting? Should they sell and walk away from the only life they had ever known? Was it worth it to continue struggling against a system that seemed so stacked against them? As tensions mounted, the family found themselves at a crossroads. One part of them wanted to hold on to the land, to keep fighting, but another part, the part that had seen too many years of hardship, too many legal hurdles, began to question if they could ever win. Yet, amid all of this, there was a quiet, burning resolve. The Turners knew that if they didn't stand up for what was theirs, if they didn't push back, they would lose everything. Everything their ancestors had worked for, everything their family had built. The fight wasn't just about land. It was about the soul of their family. And no matter how tired they were, they couldn't let it slip away without a final, desperate stand. As the Turners dug deeper, they uncovered something that chilled them to the core. The entire system had been rigged. The HOA wasn't just an innocent neighborhood organization. It was a machine designed to force people like them out. The deeper they looked, the more they realized how the zoning laws, the amendments, and the property documents had all been manipulated to suit the interests of the Montgomerys and their developer friends. The zoning board had been complicit, pushing through changes without informing the public or the landowners. The Montgomerys had pulled strings behind the scenes for years, and the Turners had been none the wiser. It was a game of power, and the rules had been stacked in favor of the rich and the powerful. It wasn't just about taking land. It was about taking power, controlling the future of the entire area, and dictating who got to stay and who had to leave. The Turners weren't the first family to be targeted, and they wouldn't be the last. There were other properties across the counties that had fallen prey to the same scheme, and the HOA had been operating with impunity, knowing full well that the odds were stacked against any family that tried to fight back. But the Turners had one thing the Montgomerys didn't: the truth. And with the help of their neighbors and their lawyer, they started gathering evidence, records of the false amendments, documents that had been altered, zoning changes that had been rushed through with no regard for the families who had lived there for decades. The corruption was exposed, and the Turners knew that this was their weapon. They weren't just fighting for their property. They were fighting for the right to have a say in their own future. They would take down the corrupt system, piece by piece. The battle had reached its peak. The Turners, with the help of their neighbors, had gathered enough evidence to take down the corrupt officials and expose the illegal activities of the HOA. Evelyn Montgomery and her team had been caught red-handed with forged documents, illegal tows, and financial records pointing directly to their operation. It was time to take the fight to the authorities. The final confrontation wasn't as dramatic as they had feared. It was, in fact, a quiet, methodical unraveling of everything the Montgomerys had worked for. When the police finally stepped in, they were able to arrest Evelyn, her husband Stanley, and several members of the zoning board. They had everything they needed to prove that the Montgomerys had been running a scam, not just to take the Turners' land, but to manipulate the entire area for their own financial gain. In the aftermath, when the dust had settled and the legal victories were secured, the Turners stood in their front yard, looking at the land that had been their home for so long. It wasn't just about keeping the RV or the house. It was about standing up for everything their family had built: the memories, the legacy, the spirit of resilience. It had all been preserved. But the victory came with a bittersweet realization. The fight had taken its toll. The Turners had faced their worst fears, but they had come out the other side stronger, with a deeper appreciation for what they had. The lessons they had learned weren't just about protecting their property. They had learned about the power of community, about the strength that comes from standing together against those who would tear you apart. And as the sun set over the farm, with the RV parked safely in its spot, the Turners knew that they had won more than just a legal battle. They had protected their home, their family, and their way of life. And that, in the end, was worth more than anything. Even as the Turners celebrated their hard-won victory, they knew the journey wasn't truly over. Evelyn's arrest was just the beginning. The Montgomerys' empire was crumbling, but the forces they had set in motion weren't easily stopped. The developers who had been eyeing the land were still out there, and the corrupt officials who had enabled them still had influence. The Turners, along with their neighbors, had taken a stand, but they knew that they couldn't rest on their laurels. The fight for land, for justice, for their future, it wasn't over. But the Turners had learned something important during this ordeal. They had learned that standing your ground wasn't just about property or money. It was about protecting what mattered most: family, community, and the right to decide your own future. As the Turners prepared for the next chapter, they did so with the strength of a family that had faced adversity and come out the other side victorious. They had a long road ahead, but they weren't afraid anymore. With each other, they could face whatever came next, and they would never stop fighting for what was rightfully theirs.